Welcome to the Renal Research Institute's Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biointelligence, where we share knowledge and advances in kidney research with the world. Joining me today for this episode is Dr. Navdeep Tangri, an attending physician and associate professor in the Division of Nephrology at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Together, we'll discuss the development of the next generation of prediction models helping transform chronic kidney disease care. Welcome, Nav.
Oh, thank you, Len. It's always great to see you. I think this might mark 10 years since we sort of initially met in Waltham, actually.
That's exactly right. No,
Yeah.
that's absolutely true. And since you bring that up, I actually wanted to chat with you a little bit about some of the original work that you started on looking at the prediction of patients with their CKD transitions and how that all initiated and what led you to that work. And I'd love to hear about this.
Yeah, so it's quite a long journey, as all these things are. And I think that there's surprises and bumps along the way. So for me, the journey started as a medical student when I had just sort of decided that I wanted to study kidney diseases, be a nephrologist. And I was looking for a research project, basically shopping around because I had been told that it's good for your CV to have research. So I found a supervisor who at that time, this is now in 2001, was using neural networks to predict outcomes in kidney disease. And he gave me data from a dialysis registry, which was a really nice dialysis registry called the UK Renal Registry. And together we set out to predict mortality in patients on peritoneal dialysis. And we then set out to investigate whether there's any center effects in mortality. And we did it using neural nets. So this is an interesting time because I think that, first of all, if I think back to 2001, 24 years ago, um, it would take a day to run the model, right? Like we would set up parameters, and it would let it run. It would take a day. So you'd really have to think about like, not changing anything on the fly because it's going to take a day. And then even the universe of reviewers and editors who would understand your work as you were submitting it was really quite narrow. Um, and but I just learned a ton from that project. I mean, first I think I sort of learned was um, that these methods are wonderful, but not always the answer and not always superior.
Mhm.
And two, that predictions really neat. Like, you can do what we do in clinical medicine every day, which is try to predict future events and try to stop them, but quantify it, like make it a science. And so I took a lot of learnings from that and thought, let's try to quantify the decisions that need like a precise probability in kidney disease, and just staying very much in the kidney disease arena. And that led me to my fellowship at Tufts with Andy Levy, who I think, if we think more generally about models, has developed the most widely used model in the world, which is the GFR estimating equation. It's a linear regression model that takes age, sex, and creatinine and predicts measured GFR, right? I mean, it's a model. Like, we don't think about that as a predictive model, but it's a model. And so I wanted to work with Andy, and Andy and I kind of sat down and tried to define the project. And we had looked at two projects potentially. One was again using better data sources to predict outcomes in patients with kidney failure on dialysis, or to predict time to kidney failure in people with chronic kidney disease. Thankfully, we chose the latter. And I had thought, and Andy and I went back and forth on this a lot. I had really thought that the success of the GFR, the MDRD, and then the CKD-EPI estimating equation, why it took over so rapidly from things like Cockcroft-Gault
Mhm.
and so quickly, was because it only required lab data. That was my kind of takeaway, that it was simple and it only required lab data. So I insisted to Andy, and Andy will corroborate this story if you ever talk to him about it, that it has to be lab data and it has to be only a handful of variables. Otherwise, no one will use it. So that's how we built the KFREs. We built them only with lab data and only with a handful of variables. I
Mhm.
mean, subsequent to that, I could probably point to a number of models which we've developed, but some of them have non-lab data, but you can always tell from reading our work that that's like we really needed some other data. We always first try to see, can we just predict using lab data only? Because labs tend to be the source of truth. Standard labs tend to be done the same way across the world. And then the whole implementation, which is like the 95% of work that needs to be done after a model is developed, it's just much easier, in my opinion, with labs than it is with demographics or comorbid
Sure.
conditions or medications or so on. So that's a long-winded answer to how it all started.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so, and you've published so much about these kidney GFR progression equations over the years, and I'd love to hear your story about it because I know back in the day they were not usually used in systems like Epic or other EMRs, and of course now they're so widely accepted. I'd love to hear your story of what led you to believe that I think publishing that information is actually an important piece of generating the evidence needed for the scientific community.
So I think again, a lot of lessons learned from always easier to do this on the shoulders of giants, right? So I can point to lots of things in my career that happened because of things I learned from Andy's experience, right? So I think we're through one very big cycle of risk equations being used, and we're about to kick off like sort of a super cycle thanks to the KDIGO guidelines that in 2024 that just came out and recommended 1A to use risk prediction equations. So one of the things I learned from Andy was that guidelines are really important. So guidelines are a lot of work. Physician, it's purely volunteer. But I think if you're a physician or a physician scientist and somebody asks you to participate on a guideline, say yes.
Mm,
Because in many, many parts of the world, payers, providers, policymakers, lab medicine people follow guidelines. They will do things the guideline says. So if you get a chance to be a part of a guideline, always do it. I think the other thing was, how do you make things automatic? How do you automate things or make it as easy for physicians to use, right? Again, Cockcroft Galt requires a weight. Weight is typically sparsely recorded in the EHR. It's not available in the lab. And obviously, there's other differences between Cockcroft Galt and MDRD. But with a big success of MDRD CKD-EPI, just the lab, right? Only the lab needs to know to report it. So that's what we did with the KFREs. And then um, on day one, and this was like a very unique thing at the time in 2011 when we published the original models, on day one of the publication, simultaneously, we had an inclusion in a smartphone application. So QX Calculate kind of implemented it on day one alongside online publication. And that was very new. That was, I think we were the first to do it at that time, which is great that now everybody sort of does it. It's expected that you create a shiny app or something, even when
mhm,
you sort of publish a model. And then it became sort of a journey where initially it was sort of me offering labs and EMR records and health systems any help. We had developed sort of a playbook on how to implement, and we would
mhm.
send this out everywhere, anyone who asked. And now it's thankfully flipped the other way around. Now we constantly get requests for, hey, we want to implement this. What's the playbook? Like, do you have, what thresholds should we use? How should we do it? And so we send that out. And I think this eye on dissemination is really, really important to get things used rather than just publishing and ending the cycle there.
Nav, I think it definitely makes a lot of sense. You mentioned guidelines and the importance of guidelines. And do you think with obviously particularly with large language models, do you think these LLMs will play a bigger role in actually creating guidelines as well in the future?
That's a really neat question. I think one of the things that consistently comes up as a criticism of guidelines is maybe shortly a little better than textbooks, but guidelines are also often considered out of date by the time they're published
Hmm.
because of the lengthy review process and so on. So how could we accelerate? First, I think LLMs have a nice role to play in evidence review, right? So abstract screening, synthesizing evidence, doing systematic review and meta-analyses faster, which are of course the backbone of a guideline, right? Like
Hmm.
the evidence review, of course. So if you could accelerate that evidence review process, you can help the guideline readers make better decisions. Then I think kind of, you know, the authors of the guideline can take all that evidence, take those tables, take those figures, write write some content for for the guideline, or let's say call it the KDIGO guideline in our case, since we're talking about kidney disease. But then how do you disseminate? So can you give that guideline to an LLM and ask it to generate a patient summary? Can you ask
Hmm.
it to generate language translations into different languages? Can you ask it to generate infographics based on the guideline to more rapidly disseminate the information? So I think there are these key forks at which LLMs can be quite helpful in sort of accelerating the adoption of evidence to practice.
I know you validated many of these equations, of course, on the KFRE equations were validated in different diverse populations globally. And I'd love to hear your perspective on using AI globally, validating this information globally, because I certainly think it's important. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so again, this would be a great part where we should compare and contrast findings because I think you come from organization that's global as well, so you probably deal with these same issues about
Mhm.
is something that we develop here applicable in another country, another region, a different patient population. It's probably a bit of a generalization, but one could say a fair generalization that a simple regression model with limited number of interactions is less, is less likely to be overfitted or is more likely to generalize in an independent sample than a more complex model which has multiple interactions, multiple nonlinearities, and going all the way to the spectrum of like a deep learning model on a narrow data set, right? So maybe it's fair to say that external validation is important for all models, but perhaps the most important for models that are developed using AI or machine learning methods. One of the things that we got over very quickly, and that I would urge the listeners on this podcast to get over very quickly, is this fear of data sharing or model sharing, right? Like
Mhm.
fear paralyzes research, fear paralyzes innovation, like, and often it's unnecessary. I'll pull out some sort of pie in the sky examples, right? So we're trying to do this project right now, and this is not specifically related to machine learning validation, but we're trying to do this project where we're trying to look at the provincial lab data and find people who are high risk for kidney disease progression who've never seen a nephrologist, and we call the project
Mhm.
safety net. So we send them a
Mhm.
mail out, we break the privacy ceiling, we send them a mail out saying, hey, you have high risk kidney disease, we're offering you a consult.
Mhm.
So we had a really difficult time with ethics boards and other privacy commissioners saying, oh, you're breaking someone's privacy by notifying them kind of sort of out of the blue, even though the notification is coming from the
Mhm.
Department of Health in a public healthcare system. And I think those people, they're not interviewing the patients and asking them necessarily, hey, if you had high risk kidney disease and someone knew about it, would you want to be notified?
Yeah.
So I think these privacy fears, while justified in like a global context, sometimes can be overblown, and maybe in a stretch, in a tangent, these privacy and fears keep validation, from happening. And everyone says, "Oh, my data can't leave, my data can't leave." Well, your data doesn't need to leave, right?
Right.
We have become so good at sending code, sending model objects, and writing scripts so that the precise output comes back in tables and figures, and you can then meta-analyze it. I mean, the entire CKD prognosis consortium, so I'll shout out to Joe Koresh and Morgan Grams here, who've done incredible work. The whole thing exists based on this federated learning concept that you don't need to share data, you just need to share output. And so you can get very comfortable validating your findings, and you should know that even if you think your model is the best, no one's going to use it in a far out place with a very different health system without local validation. So expect it, encourage it, and make it feasible, right? Because rather than saying, "Hey, believe my data," it's all good. So tell me, you know, how do you, let's call it anemia management, right? Let's say you develop an anemia management model using a US population. Uh, what are your steps before you implement in Europe, in APAC, in Latin America? So how do you do it at Fresenius?
This is a very common problem for us, as you said. I mean, just because we do have clinics, Fresenius Medical Care has clinics all over the world. So we very often may create a model that is created in one region, but we want to try to use in another region. And I think there are things that are purely biologic, which I think may be a little bit easier to say, well, that could be used globally, but then there are other things like practice patterns.
Yeah.
So, for example, a hospitalization model that may be developed on the US population, you really need to adjust it to each
Yeah.
individual country because we all know that how people go to the hospital, how frequently they go, what the payment different system, what the different payment systems are in different regions, all of that may vary quite a bit. So we will always readjust the model for things like this that is very specific to to whatever the geography that we try to use the model. And I think one of the things we always try to do, and I think I was actually going to also ask you this question, but I think we often learn something from
Yeah.
adjusting the model to another geography that then we'll say, well, you know what, we should have considered this here as well because we just didn't think about this. And I was just going to ask you this question. Can you think of examples for these KFRE equations where you said, you know what, this was developed on this population, but I actually see now by applying it to a different population, I see that maybe I should be making some adjustments and maybe incorporating additional variables that I haven't traditionally thought about by using it somewhere else.
I think so. I think we're both agreeing that adjustment and a local specification, so like a locally calibrated version of Model X is the best than Model X in its original form. Now, sometimes you don't need that local calibration, but it's a bit of a flip, right, for researchers, because
Hmm.
I think that we tend to think that, hey, I've developed this great thing, it works everywhere, and we maybe some people see local calibration as almost like a failure of the model to generalize.
Mm,
I would be in your camp, and I would argue that it's a success, that you've now given that country the best, like in our case, the best KFRE for the UK. So for us, for example, Rupert Major in Leicester
hmm.
did a UK specific KFRE, and then he developed UK specific thresholds for referral because based on UK primary, because UK has good NHS like primary care
Hmm.
data. So he had the tools to develop it, and you know different variables. I don't have enough experience to say which different variables could have been added, and some may be valuable in different countries. But
Hmm.
local calibration has been invaluable for KFRE
Yeah,
because there's nothing wrong with a UK KFRE, an Indian KFRE, a Chinese KFRE. That's okay, right?
yeah,
Like that's actually good. That's working as intended, I
yep,
suppose. Yeah.
yeah. No, I agree. And I know we touched upon this a little bit, but I want to dive into it a little bit deeper with the whole idea that now the many of these equations are incorporated into different EMRs. What do you think has led to that success? Obviously, the equation, obviously, it's you and your collaborations, but I also think publishing is a big deal. And so maybe you can talk about the publishing aspect of it.
I think publishing is really important. I think we live in a constant hype cycle, and
Yeah.
especially, again, not most true, again, about AI, unfortunately, these days than regression models. I'm sure every day on LinkedIn, you and I see lots of white papers. Anybody can make a white paper, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
that what distinguishes us from the white papers of the world is that you have gone through peer review. And yes, there are some limitations to peer review, but certainly the standard is much, much higher, orders of magnitude higher than a white paper. I also think that the barrier to publication is not insurmountable,
Hmm.
right? So,
Absolutely.
RRI is Renal Research Institute, which is an arm of a commercial entity, but you publish your work, right? It's not, so I think hiding behind a commercial entity saying, "Oh, sorry, we can't publish our work because it's proprietary and commercial," it's simply not true, right? And maybe this is something where I firmly believe that it's essential, it's a mark, and it distinguishes the best from the rest. But maybe the real answer is like the listeners, the consumers of this technology, right? The consumers of the
Hmm.
models, the consumers of the generative AI application should demand it.
Yeah.
Don't settle for the white paper because every white paper out there in dialysis or kidney disease will quote you the magical 20 to 30% reduction in events and 20 to 30% reduction in costs. The white papers don't give you an opportunity to look under the hood, whereas a
That's right.
paper, and definitely the supplement of the paper, gives you a good look under the hood and you can
Yeah.
decide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, as you said, I mean, we're very fortunate having access to a very large, at least in the dialysis on the ESKD side, to a very large database. And I think it's truly our obligation to publish, and it's truly our obligation to collaborate with the scientific community, which brings me to my next question. As you know, both you are leading this ASN AI community group that we're both part of, and I've certainly found it an extraordinary experience being part of it. And one of the things that you once said that really stuck in my head is this idea of nephrology first, AI second, which I think makes sense, of course, to me. And I think you just phrased it probably better than I ever heard it phrased in the past. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit because I
Uh,
do think this is very important to all of us,
thank
and particular clinicians.
Thank you. That's very, very kind of you. And for me, it's also been an equally fulfilling experience to be a part of this group. And I also learned so much from the incredible members that we have. The way I thought of it was that what sets us apart is that we, as physician scientists, is that we are able to try and solve a clinical problem with a
Yeah.
toolbox. And that's what I mean by nephrology first and AI second. AI is the toolbox, nephrology is the clinical problem. I think
Hmm.
if we flip the switch and we start to, or go 180 degrees or whatever, however you want to call it, if we go with the tools first and look for a problem, that will
Hmm.
lead us astray. I think it will lead us to inventing problems. It will lead us to ignore concerns about privacy and overreach, and it will diminish our role if we look for the toolbox first. And this is a bit of my rant side of it, is that I think that tech companies per se, certainly have a role to play in the ecosystem. Big tech is a
Hmm.
part of all of our lives, right? Like
Yeah.
Microsoft, Amazon, Google. And look, if you look at the players, they're dominating this space. Yes, there's a lot of
Hmm.
small vendors and startups that are in the space, but it's still very much largely dominated by the big companies, right? The
Hmm.
Amazon has Claude, and there's Meta has its own, and Google and Microsoft OpenAI. When you look at the kind of white papers that come out of some of these organizations. Sometimes they'll publish their work, sometimes it's preprints, sometimes it's white papers.
Hmm.
When you look at some of them that come out, maybe they don't intend it that way, um, but there certainly is an undertone, at least in how it's picked up in the lay media, of a sense that it's going to replace physicians or it's better at making diagnosis. The headlines always read this way. Maybe they don't mean it. When you read the preprint, it says, it has a lot of caveats. But that's
Sure.
not how the headlines come out, right? I think of countless LinkedIn or other press releases I've read over the last year where it's been like New England Journal of Medicine challenging cases, AI does better than physician, or these diagnostic cases. And I think to myself, is that really reflective of how a physician-patient relationship works? When I go see a patient, do I receive a multi-page comprehensive history with all the investigations well laid out and I'm asked to make a diagnosis? Actually, it's not like that at all, right? Like it's so much of the what we do is in gathering information, and those cases that you're asking the AI to solve, and often you're comparing to a physician who has no access to the internet, a completely unfair comparison. Today's physician is armed in technology, armed with evidence, and ready to use it. And the comparisons are not entirely fair, um, and it doesn't mimic workflow. Like the everyday practice is not New England Journal of Medicine challenging cases. So for this reason, I'm not ready for big tech to tell me that they have the answers to all my problems. I'm ready for us, the audience here, and the two of us to identify the problems and use a variety of tools, whichever is the best tool necessary
Hmm.
to solve the problem.
Yeah. No, and I would definitely say, I mean, I think some of these phrases often get s- stuck in my head, but I think one of the ones that I always remember is, the healthcare is the graveyard for some of these tech startup companies. And I do very much think one of the reasons is because physicians and clinicians are not often part of the development of what actually happens and what are these algorithms that we're developing. And to me, it is so important to have the combination of the clinician also using the technology. I mean, what you've done, as you said, 20 years ago, whenever you started working on the first models, it's because you had the clinical understanding and you're able to use the technology. And I certainly do think even if we look at our own data, before our first algorithms were put into place, clinicians would always write about anemia and prescribing ESA and EPO and how much EPO should the patients be getting. Over time, that has changed because we now have a lot more algorithms that allow
Yeah.
make that life of the clinician easier so that they can focus on more complicated cases,
Thanks.
which is of course why we want doctors to be here and they will always be here. And as you said, I think AI is a tool in the toolkit. I think we both
Yeah.
would very much agree on that topic.
Anemia is a wonderful example of where I think it can be really useful, where the marriage really works. It's upskilling.
Hmm.
Can we upskill the nephrologist by freeing up time for anemia management, maybe dry weight adjustment, maybe, vitamin D or phosphate binder prescription
Hmm.
management, and upskill them for the more complex, dialysis issues, like how do I get this patient waitlisted for transplant? And can we use um, prediction models and accompanying decision support to upskill primary care doctors to be like nephrologists, or
Hmm.
nurse practitioners or advanced practice providers to be like nephrologists? Like, so these are some of the ways I think it's like a perfect use case. You take specialist domain input, you use an LLM, you help people interpret something that they don't see every day, right? Because I think the hardest job in medicine is being primary care provider. You're expected to know everything and that everything is just growing, 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 right? So if you
Yeah.
can have some tools to upskill you before you need to reach for the specialist, that's wonderful for health systems because that means that specialists can be also upskilled because they'll be looking after the more complex cases. And
Mhm.
also that patients stay with their physician, which I think longitudinal relationships are wonderful. That's one of the main reasons we go into non-surgical medicine is because we want longitudinal relationships.
Nav, what are some of the, other than, of course, the GFR progression equations, what are some other examples that you think you personally worked on or that work's been done, particularly using AI and technology these days that have really seems to be changing the way the therapy is being delivered or treatment is being delivered?
Everything kind of starts in prediction and machine learning from images and deep learning, right? Like deep learning is
Hmm.
kind of the beginning. It's been going on for a while. It's now sort of in the very rapid upswing. So in
Hmm.
radiology, there's so many of these tools, right? And I think closely following radiology is cardiology. You see multiple approvals for echo-based or ECG-based algorithms that are now able to detect structural abnormalities just based on patterns of ECGs,
Sure.
detecting hyperkalemia, detecting amyloid cardiomyopathy. Anything like EEG, I think, is a natural fit. Spirometry, I saw recently another
Hmm.
publication, kind of learning how to interpret a spirometry. Our work is in lab data. It's sort of this idea that we are just going beyond the deep learning imaging now. And I think some of these we're going to see really flow out into practice in the next few years.
Hmm.
Now, there's a lag, right? Like I think you know this. A few years you develop a model, then some of these have to be have a regulatory path. So then there's a regulatory path, then there's the reimbursement path, then there's adoption. Even after all that, even
Hmm.
after you do regulatory and reimbursement, you still have to get adoption. You have to get people to use it. So, but
Yeah.
the attitudes are changing. I mean, these
Hmm.
days, when we talk to ASN members or even just in the general public, people want to adopt, right?
Hmm.
They say, make it work for me. I'm willing. I'm willing.
Sure.
We have willing listeners because people don't want to be left behind. So I think it's a good time if you're developing tools in this space. It's a good time.
I definitely agree with you. I guess you also indirectly bring up a little bit on the kind of the generational issue, which of course exists. I think we can all acknowledge this. I understand that it may be harder to adopt certain technology for people, who may be a little bit older or younger. There may be a little bit of a difference. I don't know how much what your thoughts are on the topic, but I do expect personally that there will be more uptake of these technologies as time goes on, certainly.
I think so. I think so. And I think that probably the best thing that people in my generation can do is stay flexible, right?
Hmm.
Because I think we don't always know best. And
Yeah.
it's very generational to think that your generation knows best and the generation before it, the younger generation doesn't know what they're talking about. So I think that we should stay open, open but critical, critically evaluate, but stay open because there's lots of good things in there that we can learn. Now, it'll be interesting. We're still, I think, early days in the daily interactions, right? Like how many interactions will we start to have with somewhere we moved from real people
Hmm.
in our neighborhood to real people in our country, to real people in a call center somewhere halfway around the world. And I think we're about to move to virtual people in a virtual call center somewhere in the world for a lot of our day-to-day interactions, right? Um,
Very
so-
possible. Very possible. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've done it. I don't know, Nev, if you guys have done a lot of this work, but certainly some of these RAGs and, things you
yeah,
could do with large language models where you can, put a lot of your source material and create much more of these chatbot-like
yeah.
interfaces to your documents.
Yeah, I think that that's like a source of truth really helps, right? So then
Hmm.
you can restrict. And I'm here from Winnipeg, Canada, and one of the leading kind of customer service provider, call center provider companies is based here in our city.
Okay.
And this is what they do. They take like the manuals and the entire guidebooks for a particular consumer, and they use large language models, and they're using RAG to really provide a customer service chatbot. Recently, I saw that our local police department is doing a trial on, for 911 calls, for for a chatbot for some sort of triage system. So I think, again, early days, probably somewhere in the 2020s or early 30s, a lot of our conversations are going to be certainly with AI agents and chatbots rather than with real people, and that'll create a societal shift. Of course, now we're really getting off course here, but self-driving is also happening. So there are these probably generational things happening as we speak, and we'll be learning the impact of it together. But you have to stay open. So
Yeah,
go right in that Waymo and and talk to the chatbot
absolutely.
and yeah, and do the thing. Yeah.
Now, can you talk a little about how AI and machine learning, what role can it play in genetics and analyzing genomes and other areas, not just purely prediction models, which of course is as you said, is the kind of the first step.
Yeah, so thank you. It's an exciting question. Some of my, most fulfilling and best things I've done in my career have been as part of drug development programs.
Hmm.
And some of it was sort of pre-AI use and just learning about how regulation works at FDA and how payer reimbursement works. And I did some of that work with Tricida, which was a biotech based in San Francisco.
Hmm.
This opportunity came where a colleague and friend Ben Hippen asked me to see if I could help this company. So
Hmm.
this is a nice story because it marries some of my sort of regulatory and reimbursement expertise with the idea of using AI to harness insights from a very large and well curated genomics database. Because when you look at genetic data from people with chronic kidney disease, it's completely dominated by people with EGFRs 45 to 60.
Hmm.
And those people, they are a mixed bag. They're people
Yeah.
with borderline creatinines. They're people with a lot of
Hmm.
muscle mass. They're people who ate a high protein meal the day before, and there are people with real kidney disease in there. So the
Sure.
signal to noise ratio is very high, in EGFR 45 to 60
Hmm.
definition of CKD. But with kidney failure, it's such a dramatic, striking event, and it's not a very common event, that when you take in the nephronomics approach, which is, what is my signal to noise ratio in someone who has kidney failure versus someone whose kidneys are healthy, then it's really amplified, a
Yeah.
lot more signal to noise. And you combine that with computational tools and AI, and you'll get some signals. So I can help. I have an opportunity to help a little bit validate some of those signals and say,
Hmm.
this is probably a true positive versus a false positive. And then you bring in like drug development, right, which is just a regulatory science. It's completely a non-AI thing,
Yeah.
which hopefully putting those things together, we have a team, and I'm far from the only expert on the team. There are incredible people on the nephronomics team.
Hmm.
Will bring therapies that'll be meaningful for kidney disease.
Yeah. And of course, I believe you also have access to, especially with ESKD, you have access to pretty extraordinary phenotypical data, which I think is quite rare in any other segment of healthcare to have so much information on the
Yeah,
patients.
very, very unique data set.
So,
And just the right time, like the right moment in time where you have this very unique data and you have the ability to analyze it to get the right insights.
in conclusion, I'd love to hear your thoughts as an expert in the field. Where do you think things are going? And maybe not in 50 years, but in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, what do you think we'll see more proliferation of in terms of tools and technology and AI tools for patients with kidney disease?
So I think there will certainly be more tools. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. I think we're definitely going to see more tools. But I hope with that also comes a higher expectation.
Yeah.
I think the consumer is going to drive this.
Yeah.
The medical consumer in this case, which is kidney doctors and nurses and care providers, should demand excellence, demand publication, and demand to understand what's driving the prediction and engine. At the same time, I think there's this willingness today to accept AI tools as
Mm-hmm.
useful decision aids in our day-to-day life. Like if you use ChatGPT to plan your trip,
Mm-hmm.
then it's okay to use a approved, like FDA cleared model to help with your clinical decision making.
Right.
Believe me, that's held to a much higher standard than planning your trip, right?
Right.
So I hope that that carries through. I hope that people take that same way that they've embraced these technologies for their day-to-day mundane tasks and say, hey, like this tool could also help me in my workflow. And where I hope all of this happens is it leads to upskilling over the next few years, that all of us across the entire spectrum, from APPs and primary care all the way out to nephrologists, and now we have like subspecialists within nephrologists, all become better. We all become faster, we become better, we're able to look after our patients more. And I think that's feasible. I think that's feasible not just in the next 50 years, that's feasible in the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm quite optimistic about
I think we're on the same page
that.
on many of these topics. I think what has happened in the past few years, and particularly now, I think we're really seeing this evolution, and I almost feel like the momentum is building.
Yeah,
Where I do think we'll see a lot more changes in the next few years, particularly in this field. I think it's been trickling
yeah.
slowly, one by one, and I do think our work, certainly on the ASN AI committee, has been very helpful in bringing some of these thought leaders together. So it's been really wonderful. Nav, thank you so much for your insights, for the discussion, and obviously for really being so instrumental in many ways. I think for starting many of these prediction algorithms, certainly on the CKD progression. So I've always admired it from the very beginning. So truly,
Thank you,
thank
Len.
you
Yeah.
for the
And thank you for
discussion
having
today.
me. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the great conversation.
And thank you to our listeners for joining the Renal Research Institute for this episode of Frontiers in Kidney Medicine and Biointelligence. We invite you to connect with us on our social media channels and stay tuned for future episodes as we continue sharing insights and advancements in kidney research.